As children, I imagine we probably all used the phrase, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never harm me." It's one of those interesting questions that struck me earlier this week. I wonder who the first person was who ever used that phrase. It certainly is a pretty universal saying that although we have all used it, I think we all know that it just isn't true. We all know from our own experience that some of the most painful and long-lasting pain that many of us have experienced is in fact words, or are in fact words that have been spoken to us or about us, either intentionally or unintentionally. In around 2006, I remember sitting at my office desk reading church-related emails. I just received an email from a church member who was very unhappy about something. It was quite painful to receive and to read it. I noted how quickly my sense of life and the sense of spirit took such a sudden dive, and there was a sense of dread that overtook me. I also realized that in that moment, how often the negative feedback so often outweighs many of the positive messages that we can receive. It amazed me at the time that I could receive 10 or 20 affirming, positive, grateful emails from other congregation members, but it took only one critical or unhappy email to almost completely obliterate the other 10 or 20 messages. I began to wonder why do our brains focus so heavily on the negative feedback that it completely eclipses the many positive messages one may have had. I resolved on that day to keep a folder of positive feedback in my computer emails, so that when I was feeling flattened or down because perhaps of a criticism I'd received, which would inevitably come again, I would be able to go back to that folder and remind myself of some of the positive feedback I'd received, just to counterbalance the negative. It was only a few years later that I came across a book that explained that our brains are designed to focus on the negative rather than the positive. And this is a survival strategy. The reason we focus on the negative is because our brains are hardwired to help us identify danger in order to protect us from that danger. The same is not true of positive messages. Your brain doesn't need to focus on them to protect you or for survival purposes, because that's not where the danger lies. And so it is that the negative voices and the negative comments can sometimes loom large in our minds and often live on within us for years and years to come. Like those positive emails that I began to store up in a folder in my email inbox, we all need to hear positive messages to affirm us and to help us know that we are on the right track. Words of affirmation are vital also in the life of a child, to help a child grow and blossom. But if truth be told, we all need words of affirmation at some point in our lives. In fact, as we touched on last week in the introductory sermon, Gary Chapman regards words of affirmation as one of the 5 main love languages, one of the 5 key ways in which we can show love to other people and in which we can also receive love from other people. Now, while all of us need to hear positive, affirming words, for some people, affirming words constitute their primary way of giving and receiving love. You may give such a person gifts, you may spend quality time with them, you may show them physical affection, you may do loving acts of kindness towards them. But for some people, these are all secondary love languages. Some of these things may indeed be interpreted positively. Others may actually make them feel a little uncomfortable and make them want to withdraw. For such people, if you really wish to speak to their heart, it will need to be through words of kindness, encouragement, and affirmation. For some people, until you have spoken with words of kindness and affirmation, they may not fully interpret your actions as love in the same way that you may intend them as love. Gary Chapman tells the story of a teenager that he was seeing for counseling. His parents were very concerned about him. He had become a problem child. He had even threatened to run away from home. Interactions between the teenager and his parents had become constantly negative and acrimonious. In listening to the story of this teenager, Gary Chapman asked him what life at home had been like when he was younger. And the teenager shared that previously things had been good between him and his parents. He shared that they had been kind and supportive of him, constantly encouraging him and saying nice things to him. But in more recent times, he felt that his parents had become constantly critical of him. And it felt like they never had anything good to say to him anymore. The way the teenager spoke, particularly about the way his parents had spoken to him as a child, and how now they would speak to him as a teenager, made Gary Chapman alert and aware to the fact that it was likely that for this young person, affirming words could indeed be his primary language of love. The primary way in which he not only gave love, but also received it. And as things began to deteriorate at home, his parents had begun to speak less and less in his primary language of love, leaving him feeling empty and devoid of love at home, and thus unable to respond in love back to his parents. Now in the gospel stories, we see many occasions how Jesus knew how to use affirming words to other people as an important language of love. I think of the story of Simon, who Jesus gives the nickname Peter, which means the rock. Jesus sees not just the surface of Simon's life. He sees not just the impetuous, headstrong, and impulsive person that he seems to be, but Jesus also sees all that Simon can become, the hidden potential that lies within him, and that one day he would become a strong foundational leader in the community of Jesus. And so, as a way of affirming Simon and this potential which Jesus sees lies within him, and as a way of drawing out of Simon his deeper potential for stability and strength, Jesus gives him the nickname Peter. Jesus speaks to Simon the language of affirming words to help him grow into his true potential as Peter, the rock on which the church would be built. Every time Jesus and others would call him by this nickname, Peter, the rock, it became another word of affirmation, affirming all that Simon was and could become. There are many other stories of Jesus speaking the language of affirming words. At the beginning of John's Gospel, Jesus finds Philip and says, "Come, follow me." Philip then finds Nathanael and brings him to Jesus, and we read that when Jesus sees Nathanael approaching, he says to him, "Here truly is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." Jesus, in seeing Nathanael, perceives something of the essence of his character just by looking at him, perhaps seeing the expression on his face. Perhaps it was something in the way in which Nathanael walked or held himself. But as Jesus perceives this quality in Nathanael, he doesn't just keep it to himself. He speaks it out loud as a word of affirmation for who Nathanael is. This is not just Jesus trying to curry favor with Nathanael, using words to manipulate Nathanael and to try and bring Nathanael under his power and influence. It is a statement free of any hidden agenda, simply an affirmation of the goodness that Jesus perceives within Nathanael. The name Nathanael means the gift of God. Jesus sees into Nathanael's heart, looks for the gift that God has placed within him, and then affirms to him what he has seen. Here, truly, is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit. I think also of that passage where Jesus is nearing his death. The story appears in Matthew, Mark, and John's Gospel, and there's a similar parallel story in Luke chapter 7. The details in John's version are slightly different from Matthew and Mark. Whereas Matthew and Mark leave her unnamed and simply refer to her as a woman, in John she is referred to as Mary, the sister of Lazarus. In Mark and Matthew, the story takes place in Bethany, the house of Simon the leper, whereas in John's version the impression is given that the event takes place in Lazarus' home. In Matthew and Mark, the incident takes place on a Wednesday, 2 days prior to the Passover. In John's version, it takes place 6 days before the Passover. But in both accounts, the woman, Mary, is criticized for her extravagant act of love toward Jesus, of pouring an expensive perfume upon him. In Matthew, it is the disciples who are said to be critical collectively. Mark's version simply says some were critical. And in John's Gospel, the last of the Gospels to have been written, it is Judas who is named as the one who speaks critically of her. But in all three versions, Jesus speaks affirming words towards her to deflect the criticism. In John's Gospel, leave her alone. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. The words in Matthew and Mark's version are even more affirming. Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing for me. And Jesus goes on to say, truly I tell you, wherever the good news is preached throughout the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. Beautiful words of love and of affirmation, spoken in her defense in the face of criticism. Lastly, and very briefly, I think also of Barnabas in the book of Acts. The name Barnabas appears to be a nickname and means the son of encouragement. His Hebrew name, according to a number of sources, appears to have been Joseph. And the fact that he was known by the name Barnabas rather than by the name of his birth suggests that Barnabas was one of those people who always had something positive to say to other people, always ready to offer words of affirmation and words of encouragement. One of those people who it was just good to be around. It would seem likely that Joseph received the nickname Barnabas because his primary love language was almost certainly the language of speaking loving and affirming and encouraging words to other people. In closing today, who are the people in your life who at important times have spoken words of affirmation and words of encouragement to you? How have you been touched by other people speaking affirming words as a language of love to you? Who are those people in your life whose primary love language may in fact be the language of speaking kind, loving, and affirming words? And lastly, in what way may you and I become instruments of God's love as we speak the language of love, words of kindness, love and affirmation towards others? And also, may each of us today hear in our hearts again those same words of love and affirmation that God spoke over Jesus at his baptism. You are my beloved. Amen.